Welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. I'm Josie Madison, editor of New York Archives. Today, we are joined by author Tim Spofford and retired New York State Archivist Tom Ruller to discuss a groundbreaking test created in the 1940s by psychologist Kenneth Clark, a New York State regent for 20 years, and his wife, Mamie Phipps Clark, in which they used dolls to prove the value of racial integration. Tim Spofford's writing career was inspired by the May 1970 slayings on the Kent and Jackson state campuses amid anti-war unrest. In 1988, he wrote Lynch Street, which reconstructs the events leading to the campus slayings of two Black students in Mississippi's capital city. A writing career focused on racial issues in education followed. For 7 years, Spofford covered educational policymaking for the Albany Times-Union. His beat included the state education department, state legislature, and the 64-campus State University of New York system. He often interviewed Kenneth Clark, a policymaker on the State Board of Regents. Spofford has taught writing and journalism in schools and colleges and has a doctorate in English from the State University of New York at Albany. He's published articles in the New York Times, Newsday, Mother Jones, Columbia Journalism Review, and other publications. Thomas J. Ruller recently retired from his position as New York State Archivist, a role he has held since 2015. Here, Tom oversaw care and access to the nearly 400 years worth of New York's colonial and state records. An active professional for 35 years, Tom is the author of several peer-reviewed journal articles and reviews on the use of technology in archives and the preservation of records in electronic form. Tom has been a consultant for several state governments and other organizations focusing on electronic records management and preservation. He remains actively engaged as a board member and steward of the Archives Partnership Trust. For those of you who have joined us today, welcome. I do want to let you know that we'll leave a few minutes at the end of the presentation for questions. So if you have questions, feel free to submit those throughout the presentation using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And now, without further ado, I am pleased to introduce Tim and Tom.
Thank you very much, Josie. Tim, great to see you.
And good to see you too, Tom, and thank you, Josie.
I've been looking forward to this presentation. I'm gonna start off with a couple of pictures because I might explain a little bit why I'm so interested in it. I worked for most of my career in the Cultural Education Center, which houses the state archives, the state library, and the state museum. The museum's exhibit halls are on the first floor of that building. Underground in that building is this 500-seat auditorium, which is named after Kenneth Clark. So few people know the tremendous impact and import of this person. They probably associate Ken Clark more with the auditorium. But this auditorium has been the venue for a large number of very important programs, including a program that we in the State Archives hosted, the State Archives Partnership Trust hosted a couple of years ago, featuring Lonnie Bunch and Harold Holzer. The Clark name has a much, much deeper and richer meaning. And I'm so excited about this program because I think it's going to help people understand why Kenneth Clark's name is more than just an auditorium, at least for those of us in Albany. Kenneth Clark and Mamie Clark were unbelievably impactful in moving the ball forward for our country and for a lot of the people within it. So I want to say thank you so much for your willingness to talk about your book and talk about these two wonderful people. So maybe I can start with my very first question. What got you interested in writing this book about the Clarks?
It began in Albany. It really did. I'm not exaggerating. Well, maybe I should say it began in Plattsburgh, New York. So I was a 17-year-old kid, freshman in college. It was a state teachers college back then, near the Canadian border. And my psych prof, young guy, Dr. Dustin, talked about this doll test. And Kenneth Clark, he named that name. And I guess I was a budding journalist without realizing it at the time. That name stuck in my mind. It didn't hurt that Kenneth was on the front page of the New York Times back then so often. that it was pretty easy to follow his career, but I didn't forget the name. But then after about 14 years of teaching, I went into journalism and to cover education. Hobby horse of mine. I love education policy, and so it was a dream job for me. I loved it, and I got to cover the regents. Kenneth was the very first Black regent, appointed by the legislature in 1966, and here he was in his final year on the board, and I got to see him in action in the regent's boardroom, and I got to interview him that first day I saw him. Upstairs in the regent's chambers, and for about an hour and a half, and I was enthralled. Wrote a piece about him, and that day when I first met him personally, I expressed condolences for the loss of his wife, who had fairly recently died, Mamie. And he said to me, put his hand on his stomach and said, "Oh, I feel like I've lost an organ." And I was told before the interview that he was depressed, very depressed, that he was having a lot of trouble recovering from the loss of Mamie. And I thought at that moment, that was quite a while ago, that there was a compelling love story there, and a story of civil rights, the story of the history of America. And I wanted to bring them together, and that's how it happened.
Well, I'm excited about reading this book. Just to set a little context for the Clark's work, they started in the 1940s, really in earnest with their research. Can you talk a little bit about what was segregated America like in the Clark's day, especially in the public schools?
Yes, I'd like to do that very much. It's hard for us today to realize, but it really is true, particularly in the South, in rural areas. Many rural areas of the South, if not, I think I should say most rural areas in the South had no secondary education for Black children at all. So school ended in the elementary years or the middle school years, and that was pretty much it. The state of those schools was, particularly in the rural areas, disgraceful. Thurgood Marshall called them dog houses. A very typical rural elementary school for Black children in the South was like this. It would have been wooden, clapboard, a white, maybe unpainted wood, pot-bellied stove in the classroom, outrageously overcrowded. The pot-bellied stove would often spit coals onto the wood floor, and a child would be asked to use a pair of tongs to throw the coals back in the stove before the schoolhouse burned down. The children had to share an outhouse, maybe two outhouses. There was a dipper, a bucket of water and a dipper somewhere near the front stairs to the schoolhouse, and the kids drank from that. And there were no school buses that would come on. No, I mean, the white school board just said simply no. In fact, usually often the land for these schoolhouses was contributed by Black parents. Black parents helped build the school. Some of these schools, many of the schools, thousands, were built with seed money from Julius Rosenwald, the Sears retail tycoon. But he only provided seed money. The Black community or the school board had to ante up and pay for some of that. And very often the Black parents helped build it and maintain it. School boards very often refused to heat the buildings. Black parents had to chop the wood to do that, or provide the coal, pay for the coal. The kids in the white schools in the rural areas back then had water fountains, they had chemistry labs, they had wood shops, they had And very often when those their school buses would pass black kids walking miles to school, the white kids would give them the finger and shout epithets out the windows at them. This is a pretty grim picture, but I have to tell you, most people knew about it at the time, but we have since forgotten. We'd like to forget this, but I'm talking about a system where black children receive no secondary education in rural areas unless they had a relative in a city like Wilmington, Delaware, Jackson, Mississippi, something like that, where those cities had better brick schools, vastly overcrowded, under-resourced, incredibly, dog-eared books, broken typewriters, still in those city schools, but at least there was something. So that's what it was like. Now the whole country was segregated. In the North, it wasn't just the South. In the North, if you were a traveler, a black traveler, your chances of getting into a motel were not very good, or a hotel. They just weren't. That was reality at the time. If you were injured, you might even have trouble getting into a hospital. In the South, hospitals were pretty much closed to blacks, and it's tragic. No ambulance services, just about nothing. You went to the doctor's office if it was open, and you just took your chances. The job market was completely segregated. The Clarks even though they had doctorates from an elite university, Columbia University, they had a hell of a time. It took years for them to settle into careers because it just didn't matter whether you had a degree. Unless you worked for the Urban League or the NAACP or church or your law firm, a black law firm, your chances of getting a professional job in an integrated atmosphere were pretty much nil. That was life before Brown.
And into this world, the Clarks, as young professionals, as young doctors, enter. And so Hattie is from the Deep South. Kenneth is not, wasn't born and raised down there. Can you talk a little bit about what their personalities were like and where they met and how their paths intersected?
Sure. Mamie Phipps, who eventually married Kenneth, she was very bright, went to a segregated school black school in Hot Springs, Arkansas, which was a resort town. It was a bustling little resort area with geothermal springs, and people flocked from all over the world to Hot Springs to take the water cure. And so that's where she's born. Her father is a physician. By the standards of his caste and class, he was a rich man because he was both a physician and a hotelier. He ran a black hotel, and that seems like maybe a very strange occupation for a physician, but there's a reason for it, and that is that the hotels there were two big luxury black hotels for ailing black pilgrims who went to Hot Springs for the water cure. They could go to the hotel to get health care. They had those geothermal waters piped right into the hotels. So it made sense for him to be the manager of this luxury hotel, as well as a physician on call at that hotel. So Mamie came from a privileged background. Kenneth was born in Panama, and he emigrated as a little boy with his grandmother, went through Ellis Island. His mother had arrived in Harlem 2 years prior to him with her baby girl, so she could get a job, get an apartment, get established, and be able to take the whole family together in her apartment. So Kenneth grows up in integrated Harlem, and nominally integrated. The Harlem was really a very it was an overdeveloped neighborhood of luxury apartments, and as a result, there were a lot of vacant apartments, and they pretty much subdivided those apartments and fit in lots of black families. And Harlem then began turning black very, at first gradually, but then very rapidly. So when he arrives in, I think 1920, he goes to an elementary school that's integrated, majority white. Most of the kids are Jewish or Irish, and the Irish are the largest of the ethnic groups at that time in Harlem. By the time he makes it to middle school, the majority of kids in his classes are black. I mean, it didn't take that long for that to happen, and in successive years became much more densely black populated. But the fact of their origins, she from the South, he from the North. His mother is a seamstress in the garment district of New York. She's poor. She believes in education. She believes in civil rights. She's becomes a labor organizer. She's one of the first female black shops, first female shop stewards in the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. No, some say she's actually the first black shop steward, but anyway, she's way ahead of her time. So she's outspoken. One time she went to a cafe with Kenneth, and she wasn't getting served on time. And Kenneth tells us that she threw down the plates on the floor, and smashed them, and grabbed his hand and walked out with him in protest of the fact that she wasn't being served because she was black. That's the kind of woman she was, and that really helped shape Kenneth's personality. He could be brash, he could be bold, he was outspoken just as she was, he was opinionated, he loved to hold forth, he loved to talk, he was very loquacious. Mamie, on the other hand, was very shy, very high-strung, very nervous, oddly confident, but still, when it came to speaking, she was loath to state her opinions. She had a phobia for public speaking. She was very demure, very beautiful. She was very well turned out. She was always dressed to the nines. She was had an aristocratic mien, but yet she had the same passion about education that Kenneth and Kenneth's mother had. Her father was this physician, but he had been a schoolmaster. So education in both these families was very important. Mamie, so Mamie is really so soft-spoken. Upper middle class black families were often, the children were often schooled, were taught, raised to be very soft-spoken, quiet, and not loud, to not seem to be lower caste. And so Mamie was very loath to speak, and she spoke in a very, very tiny, soft voice. Kenneth was never loud, far from it, but he had no problem speaking his mind about anything. So those are the two very different people.
But like a perfect team. Like
Yes.
the strengths of one helped with the weaknesses of the other, and vice versa.
Right.
You've given us a couple of photos of the Clarks. I want to share those because I think it's nice to associate a face with a name. This is the Clarks in the 1940s when they were at the beginning of their career. Yeah.
This is toward probably the end of the 40s or early 50s. I'm not sure exactly, but I suspect the late 40s. By this time, they've done most of the things for which they're known well today, believe it or not. They had their degrees. They both went to Columbia, got PhDs in psychology. Their Ivy League school. They got married. They had two children, a boy and a girl. They had already founded a psychiatric center for children at risk in Harlem, and that was called the Northside Center for Child Development. So it begins at 1946. Basically, they formed it by getting a bunch of friends together who were psychologists, psychiatrists, and social workers. Um, and uh, and they ran into trouble. They went $30,000 into debt at a time when Kenneth was probably making only about $2,000 a year. And they found an angel who helped bail them out. And now that center, Northside Center, still exists today to help children at risk in New York City. So why don't we move to the next? Yes, this is Mamie's side of the family. Her parents in Hot Springs. This is their house, which served as a kind of elite Black B&B for very prominent Black tourists in Hot Springs. If the hotel was crowded or there were no vacancies, or sometimes just because they knew many of these rather celebrated personages who came into Hot Springs. But that's Harold Phipps, and that's Katie Phipps, his wife, and they both worked together on that hotel. So let's take a look at the next picture. And this is young Dr. Phipps in St. Kitts. So one of the things the Clarks have in common is that they, both of the Clarks, Mamie and Kenneth, is they both had a forebear from the Caribbean. And this is Dr. Phipps before he becomes a doctor. It's probably around the time that maybe he finishes his degree in Jamaica, I'm not sure, but this is probably taken in St. Kitts long ago. That is his mother. Okay, the next picture. This is Mamie's other side of her family. This is the Smiths. This is the Smiths, not the Phippses. This is the Smiths, and that man in the back with the handlebar mustache was her grandfather Smith, and Jesse Rufus had been enslaved in Virginia before the Civil War, and eventually migrated north to at first to New York State in the Nyack area. And then he went down to Philadelphia, and then he'd heard that there was this new promised land, Hot Springs, Arkansas, and decided to migrate there. And his wife had died, and first wife. And so he remarried a much younger woman. And this is Mamie Smith, Mamie Johnson Smith. And Mamie had a degree, a bachelor's degree. She got it from a college in Nashville, and it wasn't an elite college, Roger Williams College in Nashville. And she also attended for a time at in Atlanta, a college in Atlanta that escapes me right now. But the young boy there, barefoot with blonde hair, who looks white, is not white. He is his skin looks a little dark because it's summer, and he's got a suntan. But that is Mamie Clark's. Well, this is Mamie Smith's son, Alfred E. Smith, the same name in effect as the New York governor, and he became a member of the Black Cabinet, FDR's Black Cabinet. He became a very celebrated, influential person. He had a very popular column that ran in all the Black newspapers of the country, just about. And he was in that Black Cabinet because he had a influential position in the Works Progress Administration, WPA, and he helped get tens of thousands of Black people jobs. So out of this little town of Hot Springs, there were two Black persons who emerged as historic figures. And they both came from the same family. One was Mamie Phipps Clark and Alfred E. Smith.
Wow.
And this is Kenneth Clark's family in Cologne. His grandfather is the man you see there with the you can see the chain from his fob watch, and his father Arthurton is the young man with the boutonniere up there in the back to the right, the back row to the right. That is Arthurton, his father. It was a big family, very middle class. They were both Arthurton, Kenneth's father, and his grandfather were supervisors on the docks of Cologne, which were good jobs because the Panama Canal was being built at this time. Kenneth was born the week of the first shakedown cruise through the Panama Canal. It had just finished,
Wow.
1914.
Wow.
And so it was a kind of a boomtown, Cologne, and that's where Kenneth was from. And at about 6 years old, he goes to Ellis Island and settles eventually in Harlem. Okay. And there he is. That's his passport. In the year that he spent a year in Jamaica, in Kingston, the capital, getting a British education for 1 year and getting a sense of his family's roots. His family was of Jamaican heritage, although they had jobs in Panama, as many Black people did from the Caribbean to build that canal. They were the biggest ethnic group working on that canal. So here's little Kenneth. Next picture. And here he is as a teenager, and he was a budding sculptor. He wanted to be an artist, wasn't very talented, which he admitted, but he had lots of artist friends, including the great Jacob Lawrence, Romare Bearden, Charles Pinky Alston. These were all great Harlem artists who were very well known in their day, and some of them gave Kenneth their artworks. And he bought some of them, and he had a big collection, and it was assessed in the early 21st century at $4.2 million. So he was quite a collector of African and African-American art. Okay, next picture. That's him with his mom after Kenneth and Mamie moved from Harlem. They lived in Harlem for many years. But then they moved to suburban Hastings on Hudson. And that's them in front of their fireplace. Kenneth revered, adored his mother. She was just the most influential person in his life. Next picture. This is a photograph of the doll test, simulated doll test. And this is the back room of the first offices of the Northside Center for Child Development. And basically Mamie ran that clinic. Kenneth was her assistant. And to promote Northside, Kenneth was the outside man. He was the publicist. He was the guy that liked reporters. And he got Gordon Parks to do a series of photos for Ebony magazine. And Ebony did a big story about the Clarks and Northside Center and the doll test. So like 3 angles they went at for this piece. So this was the world's first real introduction to the doll test. It's 1947 July edition. And the reason for it was to promote Northside Center. But we've got these wonderful pictures now from Ebony magazine that Gordon Parks did. Now, Gordon was a very celebrated photographer and filmmaker.
Mm-hmm.
And many of us of a certain age have seen Shaft, the movie, Richard Roundtree as Shaft. Gordon Parks directed that. And he also
did?
Yes, he did. He directed it. And he also directed The Learning Tree, another celebrated movie. So he's a very famous guy. And I have I've been in 3 museums in which this this or other pictures from this series were featured as great the works of great African-American photographers. So this picture hangs on museum walls across the country. And just walking in the museums, I've run into this picture 3 times.
Wow.
So, okay, next picture.
What I'm gonna, because I think that our next picture might be the picture of the book. Can we talk a little bit about the doll
Sure.
test?
Sure, yeah,
I
let's
think
do
that's
that.
that's like the center of the book that you've written. It's
Right.
maybe not the center, but the Clarks are the center, but really
Right.
the foundation. So
Right.
what was the doll test, and how did it
The
work?
doll test, Kenneth and Mamie in 1940. They'd already done it by the time you saw that first picture. They had done this test in 1940 on a scholarship from the Rosenwald Fund. Julius Rosenwald, that Sears tycoon who provided the seed money for all those, something like 5,000, nearly 5,000 black schools in the South. He also provided the money for scholarships for black artists and intellectuals to do work which would further their careers. And Kenneth and Mamie both won one, and they took the money and they did the doll test. And this was presenting to black children, young children, 4 dolls. Usually the pictures show just a black doll and white doll to simplify, but they would put 4 dolls in a staggered lineup. Kenneth did the test. Mamie was raising a baby at the time. In fact, when he started, she was pregnant. But anyway, he'd have them in an integrated, staggered lineup. Black, white, the dolls. And then he would ask, he did ask 253 black children, about half, roughly half from the South, half from the North, not far from Albany. Springfield, Massachusetts was the northern town where he did it first. And 2/3 of those children rejected the brown dolls that most looked like them. And they favored the white dolls. And some of those children wept during the course of that test and left the room. Some of them denied they were black. Some of them used racial epithets to describe the brown doll. And this is all very surprising behavior, but Kenneth construed this as evidence of a inferiority complex among these black children. And eventually Thurgood Marshall heard about this, and also an important study Kenneth did that we can talk about later, and it asked him to be the consultant on the social science evidence of the damage that prejudice does to black children. And that's how Kenneth and the doll test got involved in the Brown versus Board of Education cases, which was really 5 cases, 4 state cases, lawsuits in federal court brought by Thurgood Marshall and Robert Carter, his right-hand man. And both Mamie and Kenneth testified in the Virginia cases, and Kenneth testified in a total of 3 of the 4 cases. And the U.S. Supreme Court rolled together these 4 cases presented by the NAACP, along with a 5th from the Washington schools, and just called them together Brown, and rendered their ruling in 1954, making segregated education, dual school systems, racially separate, illegal, unconstitutional. So, I mean, this was the most momentous decision of the 20th century from the Supreme Court, and it really changed education in America. For instance, suddenly, even before the the court ruled, because of all these lawsuits, Southern school boards began building black schools, better black schools.
Mhm.
And suddenly rural communities began to have black high schools for the first time. They were trying to avoid segregation, integration, and that's the only reason they built. But that's how the Clarks helped change the world.
And we're just celebrating the 70th anniversary of the Brown decision by the Supreme Court just this past month.
Right.
And really, it almost seems like without the Clarks' sort of empirical research and empirical data, the effect of segregation wouldn't be as strongly understood and easily understood. So this Doll test really seems to be, again, fundamental to our understanding of the impact of segregation and the impact of communicating to children, young children, that they are second-class citizens and they don't deserve the same things as others do.
Right. Kenneth, I should add, did this study for the White House Conference on Children and Youth in 1950. Now, every 10 years, at the beginning of each decade, the presidents of the United States would call together experts nationwide to study the problems of American youth and how to solve them, how to resolve them, how to move the country forward through moving its youth forward. And Kenneth was asked to write a paper on prejudice's impact on minority children. And so what he did was an intensive study looking at all the available social science research at that point, right up to 1950, that showed the damage that prejudice did to children. And what he found was studies of all kinds, and he did a very good synopsis of those studies, a report on those studies that showed that Italian American children, Jewish children, Mexican American children, indigenous people we used to call Eskimos from the Northwest, Native Americans, all these ethnic groups, including simply migrants, even white migrants, suffered prejudice in their communities because of their being so different as the population, the greater white population saw them. And so Kenneth was not, as he's often accused of saying of denigrating blacks by saying blacks have this odd, eccentric inferiority complex. He really argued that a sense of inferiority is natural to all children. That we grow up feeling inferior to our parents and our older siblings. This is an idea that Alfred Adler, the psychoanalyst, advanced. He was a colleague of Sigmund Freud. And so that idea was the idea that the Thurgood Marshall's inner circle latched onto, the impact, the damage that prejudice does to children. And it became the forming principle of their argument before the Supreme Court. And that's why it's so important. That's why the Clarks are so important.
Well, it sounds like the test was accepted by the scientific community and as well as by the public policy community. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Even the NAACP lawyers in Marshall's inner circle fought like hell over. William Coleman argued that Felix Frankfurter would just burst out laughing and wouldn't take this seriously. The court would not take this argument seriously, and so there were other members of the inner circle that disagreed. But Bob Carter, this was really his hobby horse. He kind of liked psychology and he really liked Kenneth. And he started reading all kinds of psychology articles and books. And he was Thurgood's right-hand man he was the architect of the social science argument for striking down school segregation. Kenneth was the one who provided concrete detail, the evidence, the studies. And so that's how that team, Kenneth and Bob Carter, blending in with Thurgood Marshall, one carried the day. Thurgood was like the referee, and he sided with Bob Carter and Kenneth on this.
Do researchers still conduct and use this doll test today?
All over the world, all over the world, all over the United States. Some countries that I know of that did dolls tests are Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Italy, I think Trinidad and Tobago. I'm sure Canada, but probably other nations I just don't know about.
Mhm.
But this is still conducted to this very.
And the test results, I'm thinking back here in the United States, it's test and retest to say, have our efforts had an impact? Do they still conduct this doll test with children today in the United States? And does it give different results?
Starting in the 1960s, a period when you have the Black Arts Movement, the Black Pride Movement, you have the Black Power Movement, you begin to see a flowering of great self-respect in the Black community, a sense of appreciation for the art, history, and the test results by the late 60s begin to reflect that change. So this is still this sense of inferiority, a lack of confidence, self-esteem. This still shows up on many of the doll tests that different researchers conduct. And by the way, sometimes it's just students, like even high school kids. A young girl named Carrie Davis, it's on the internet. She did a filmed kind of test, a doll test of her own. She made a film that's about 7 minutes long, and you can get it on YouTube. Kiri Davis, Kiri, common spelling Davis, and see the results. And you'll see that still Black children will reject brown dolls and sometimes say things that you're really quite stunned by. But more importantly, perhaps we ought to say that today's doll tests usually involve white kids. White kids are often not shy about using racial epithets or making very anti-Black statements about why they prefer the white doll. And Anderson Cooper twice had week-long series of doll tests in 2012, I believe, in 2014, after Obama was elected. His team wanted to see how that might have changed the results. And the results are, there were white kids on television saying really derogatory things. Their mothers were there on camera, tearing up, one of them actually crying, and in embarrassment if nothing else, to see her little child reject white dolls and give racial reasons for rejecting accepting white dolls and rejecting Black dolls. And some of those Black children also on camera rejected Black dolls, and you know, in a really embarrassing way. So is everything all good and hunky-dory and it's all over? No. I had one young Black man write to me, email through my website, and asked if he could talk to me on the phone. We talked, and he said, you know, I think we still have this problem today. He said, don't you think it's possible that young Black people are shooting young Black people because they feel through the gun they get some kind of self-respect? It is a way of enhancing their self-esteem. They have power, they have agency, And I thought that was a compelling argument, and I think Kenneth Clark would probably agree with that.
Can we shift gears a little bit? Because I mean, this experiment and this work put Kenneth and Mamie on the map, and they did a lot of other incredibly important work. Towards the end of his career, and you talked about this at the very beginning, Tim, he was a member of the State Board of Regents, which is the board that sets educational policy for the state of New York. Can you talk a little bit about Clark's time on the board, his relationships with the other board members, and the kinds of efforts that he advocated for within his role as a regent of the university?
Sure. Maybe I should preface this, though, with this remark. Kenneth became the foremost Black scholar of the 60s and 70s, the Civil Rights era. So when he arrives on the Board of Regents, he's really quite famous. He's on television all the time. He's in print all the time. He has just written a bestseller, Dark Ghetto, that is used by policymakers in Washington and nationwide to advance arguments for things like affirmative action and integration. Dark Ghetto was translated into nearly a dozen languages. It was that big a book. And it came at a great time when cities were burning. When Kenneth goes onto the board, our cities were in flames, and they continued to be in flames for 2 or 3 years after. So this is the man, the first Black man to join the Board of Regents. He's very famous, and he is a historic figure because of his really important contribution as the consultant, the social science consultant to Thurgood Marshall for the NAACP. So he arrives in this boardroom, Regents boardroom, with oil paintings of regents of great renown that some of us may have heard of. Alexander Hamilton, I think a few of us might have heard of him, and John Jay. But here he is, really the only living historic figure on the Board of Regents. And so what happened was, by around 1970, you have people like George Wallace and Richard Nixon who've made a political issue out of busing, school busing for the purposes of integrating schools. And they were trying to stop it nationwide, trying very hard, very aggressive. And what happened was you had a movement, a right-wing movement, conservative movement that spread to even New York State. And you had state lawmakers that did not want to, this is the North, this isn't Dixie, did not want to integrate the schools, wanted them to stay pretty much as they were. So you had cities, not just New York City, but cities like New Rochelle and Buffalo that had terrible integration, segregation problems. In the case of New Rochelle, I mean, the city was basically broken in half. I mean, the Black schools on one side of the city, white schools on the other side of the city. I mean, clear evidence of a dual school system based on race. And well, board members, the legislature began packing the board with conservative lawmakers who were anti-busing. And Kenneth fought them like crazy. And he was a real scold to them. And he was talking to the press all the time. He was on the front page of the New York Times all the time. Sometimes he called for placing the New York City school system in receivership. In other words, educational bankruptcy. I made big headlines with calling for that. He even testified in a Buffalo civil lawsuit trial against the Board of Regents, of which he was a member. And one board member slipped him a note. His first name was Eddie, Edward, and I can't remember what his name was now, but he told Kenneth's health was in kind of decline at the time in the 70s. He warned him that he was making himself disliked on the board, and he was destroying his own health by this hell-bent fight against school segregation. And on the other hand, Kenneth was somebody who had great he had a pretty high emotional intelligence quotient, and he reached out to people on the other side of the aisle. Willard Genrich, who became chancellor, and for many years later, just a regular rank and file member of the Board of Regents, who really believed in children, who really believed in public schools, but did not. But I believe that he probably felt that busing for the purpose of integration was only going to further white flight from the city's school systems. That was probably his firm belief. Kenneth accepted him as a good friend. They got along. They were very good friends. So Kenneth was a gadfly. He aligned himself with Ewald Nyquist, who was an integrationist, avid integrationist, and Kenneth raised hell on the board when the Board of Regents fired Nyquist. So this was the thing that was going on in the city. I mean, in the city of Albany at the Board of Regents meetings.
Just to make my gratuitous plug for the State Archives, Ewald Nyquist's records as Commissioner of Education are preserved and available for research in the State Archives, as are the minutes and records of the State Board of Regents, including the period that Kenneth Clark served on the board. We only have a couple of minutes left, and then we'll take some questions, but I just want to share a photo that you shared with us. This is Kenneth Clark in his later years, and when they had a consulting firm. This is probably after he left his public
retired.
life.
Yeah, that's right. He founded the first Black think tank, the Metropolitan Applied Research Center, and it advocated for government and public policy that would help the poor in the inner cities, particularly in New York City. When he retired from that, plus he'd been teaching for more than 30 years on in the City University of New York system. When he retired, he set up this consulting firm to work with corporations to increase minority hiring and recruiting, and in mediating, troubleshooting difficulties between employers and white employees and Black employees, all that kind of conflict that was happening in the 70s. That was the consulting firm. His family members were involved in it, and you have Hilton, his son, on the left, and Kate Clark on the right, and Mamie in the back there.
Fantastic. What the Children Told Us, your book, the untold story of the famous doll test and the Black psychologists who, as we've just heard, they changed the world.
By the way, that's another Gordon Parks photograph.
It's got Gordon Parks written all over it. It's
yes.
And that's, as a side note, there have been a number of exhibits of Gordon Parks photography all over the country, including we had a wonderful exhibit here in Albany a few years ago. If you ever have the chance to take that an exhibit of his work in, please do so. But What the Children Told Us, available through independent bookstores all over the country. We really encourage you to take a look at this, dive deeper into the lives of these two incredibly important people and the impact that they've had on all of us. Josie, I assume we have about 5 more minutes for some questions, and I'll stop my share. I'll leave it up for about 10 seconds more so people can write down the title of the book, and then we'll go to see any questions that we might be able to answer.
Yes, well, so far we don't have any questions. So if anybody has a burning question, now is the time to send that in. But I always think it's a good sign you must have covered all the material that anybody might possibly be interested in. So I
Would
think
you, are we going I could talk about archival research
oh,
for
I
a
would
moment.
love that.
A minute. I'm often asked, where'd you get your information? And all over the country. And so I spent many years on this. And Kenneth's papers are in the Library of Congress, the Rare Books and Manuscript Division. And he was a pack rat, and he had about almost 500 boxes of documents. And it's a very big collection, and one of the most often chosen by researchers to look at. The two boxes on the doll test are among the most often requested by researchers. So that's how important the doll test is. Mamie's, Northside Center for Child Development had papers from Mamie's era at the New York Public Library. Just a very, very useful collection. Not terribly big, but 2 or 3 great big boxes. And it was very, very helpful to tell the Northside Center story. I went all over the country, really, to look at the Brown versus the Board of Education transcripts for the various state trials. And and so that brought me, Washington at the National Archives, and also in Philadelphia, the National Archives has a Philadelphia branch. That's where I got the Virginia transcript that was so important to me. In Lawrenceville, Texas, I think it's Lawrence or Lawrenceville, Arkansas, excuse me. The University of Arkansas has the papers of Mamie's uncle, Alfred E. Smith, that were really helpful, really helpful. He was the gentleman who was on the Black Cabinet, and he was her uncle. But also he had papers at Moreland Spingarn Research Center at Howard University, which is where the Clarks met as young people, fell in love at Howard University. Kenneth was a big wheel in student government, and he was the newspaper editor. He was a hot shot on campus, and Mamie was a young freshman, much sought after by the young men. Kenneth had to work real hard to get her affection. So anyway, those are some. Of course, I went all over the country interviewing people, finding people here and there, all the way down to Florida. That's where his daughter ended up living. I chased her Switzerland and Hong Kong, Hastings, New York, and but finally I got her more permanently for intensive interviews in Osprey, which is a town outside Sarasota, Florida, which was very helpful to me because I was living in St. Petersburg, Florida at the time. But yeah, I've just been all over. I spent a month living in Arkansas, Hot Springs, a fascinating resort town, really fascinating place. And I spent almost a year living in Washington because, 500 boxes is not something you go through tripping. So
no, I think your
great.
and your story tells us something very important about doing archival research, work in primary sources, is you need to know the context in which people operated. So knowing the centers and the records that they created, knowing where people came from, their relationships with different institutions, and finding those and then chasing those trails is really, really important. As archivists, that's what we're all about, is putting information that we preserve into some context, because without the context, it doesn't really mean anything. And without the context, you can't find where it is. So
exactly.
One of our guests today has pointed out that the arrangement and description of the North Side Center records at the New York Public Library was funded through a State Archives Documentary Heritage Program grant.
Ah, there you go.
It's important to
Well,
note.
again, at the State Archives, we're committed to making sure that archival records, any that document in New York, regardless of where they are preserved and available. And that's very important to us. And Tim, this has been a great conversation. I have really appreciated it a whole lot. I know that our audience now and our audience who are going to watch this on YouTube over the next millennia, because nothing on the internet.
Well, thank you, Tom. I really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun.
Good. Thank you. Josie.
Yeah. Well, thanks to you both. Thanks, Tim and Tom, for this excellent presentation. And thank you to everybody who joined us and who will be joining us in perpetuity on YouTube. If you're interested in learning more about Tim's book, What the Children Told Us, you can always visit his website at timspoffordbooks.com. Also, Tim's article on this very topic was published in our spring 2024 issue of New York Archives magazine, which is available now. You can visit our website at nysarchivestrust.org for more information about that article or to subscribe, which I highly recommend. It's our privilege to make these events available to you and to keep New York State's history alive. If you're interested in the content we create and would like to see some more of it, please send us an email at aptrust@nysed.gov, and you can receive a free past issue of New York Archives magazine. So this concludes our season of speaker series for now, and this has been a great way to end it. So thanks again, Tim and Tom.
Thank you, Josie.
We are working on our new season schedule. So as soon as that's finalized and available, you can find that on our website at nysarchivestrust.org. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.
So long. Thank you.